Hi everyone. Today I'm sitting here interviewing Tanya Ott, and today we'll hear her story. How are you doing today, Tanya?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Fabulous to be interviewing someone like yourself.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
All right, let's jump right into the interview. My first question for you is, what made you go into audio journalism?
So it's actually a funny story. I wanted to be a Broadway star, and because I was a musical theater kid, and that was like incredibly not realistic. Or at least my parents had no concept of that being a thing. So I had this like crazy idea that if I went into journalism, and particularly broadcasting and particularly television, which was my plan, that I would become the next Barbara Walters. Might be a reference that you can reach or not reach based on your age. But she would often interview, notable politicians, but also artists. And I was like, I'm going to become Barbara Walters. I am going to interview someone on Broadway, and they're going to say, why don't you sing and dance with me? And then I'd be like, well, if you insist. And then I'd be discovered, right? Of course, it didn't work out that way. Freshman year of college at the University of Florida, a professor who ran the newsroom at the NPR station came into one of my classes and spoke and talked about what NPR, National Public Radio, does, and that they needed volunteers. And so I went and volunteered as a freshman and fell in love with audio, and I've never looked back.
Oh my gosh, being the next Barbara Walters, I do understand that. So that's just so crazy that was your plan. I love
that. That's like totally an 18-year-old plan.
Literally,
right?
Greatest plan I've ever heard.
Yes, totally thought out.
So what is the first story you ever produced?
I don't remember the first story that I ever produced because I was working on a 4 a.m. shift writing newscasts. But I will tell you the most memorable story of my first year as a student journalist was that, so we had a newsroom that students ran completely, and we produced a lot of news every single day. And a year into that, we had a serial killer who came to the University of Florida and killed 5 students, one of whom I knew, and that was the first big story that I got to cover. So I was out there with international press covering the story, going to press conferences over and over and over a span of a couple of days as bodies turned up. So a really challenging story to tackle as a 20-year-old student journalist, but it was a really important story to cover, and I ended up covering that story for about another year and a half or so.
Wow, definitely a heavy story. Definitely something I would definitely remember if it were me in your shoes.
Yeah, that's the one I remember. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. What is the most interesting place you have traveled for a story?
Oh my gosh, I slept in an underwater hotel.
No way.
Yes, I did. So here's the story. I'll give you a little backstory first. First of all, it looked a little bit like a trailer, like 3 trailers kind of attached to each other. And it used to be used to train astronauts. They would sink it way down in the ocean, and the astronauts would go down there and they'd do psychological tests like turn off all the lights and make them do things down there and make sure they don't go crazy, right? So they can go up in space.
Right.
So there's this astronaut named Scott Carpenter, and he's watching Miami Vice. Do you remember that show?
Yes.
Okay. So he's watching Miami Vice one day, and he's watching the 2 cops, the leads, run across, in front of some containers at a port. And he's like, oh my gosh, that's where I trained as an astronaut. So he went and bought it. And he was really after he left being an astronaut, he became very interested in oceanography and marine biology. So he had this place in Key Largo, which is one of the top keys in the Florida Keys, and he had an education center. So he ran camps on marine biology and things like that. So he took the trailer and he sunk it 32 feet under the ocean in a lagoon, not right out in the waves. And he turned it into a hotel where it only slept like 8 people, right? Mm-hmm. So I was working for a travel show called The Savvy Traveler. I was based in Florida. They sent me down there. I'm terrified of water. Like, I have rules. My children had to swim further out in the ocean than I did, so the sharks would eat them first. That sounds really cruel, but I really don't like the water.
Okay.
So it's like, okay, so I have to learn how to scuba dive. I have to dive down 34 feet under the ocean and then pop back up inside. It's like a teacup set upside down, so there's a hole in the bottom of it, and you scuba dive under it and come up through it. And so I made my husband, who was a competitive triathlete, go with me because he swam in the ocean all the time. And I was like, you're going to be my, I don't know, what's the thing? Key grip? Is that sure? We'll use that term. You're my key grip. You're going to go down there with me. So yeah, I slept in an underwater hotel.
Oh my gosh, that's so amazing. I can't even, I don't like water either, especially when it comes to scuba dive. Like, I can chill by the water, but go in
yeah.
deep into the water and scuba dive.
Nah. But actually, it wasn't that bad. It was actually really cool. And the underwater hotel had this big window that was a circle that was probably 8 to 10 feet across. And you could look out it and you could see all the fish swim by. And it was really, really cool.
So it was worth the dive to go down there.
It was totally worth the dive.
That's so great to hear. Have you ever done anything crazy to get a story?
Okay. Yes. I once almost got arrested covering a story. So North Florida, it's my last day before, like I had just graduated from college and I'm moving out to take a job in Denver, Colorado. And some of our audience in Macon may be familiar with Suzanne Lawler. She's at WMAZ. She's been on the air there for a very, very long time. She and I were covering a story together. We decided to go up to North Florida. There was going to be a Klan rally. And it was a Klan rally being held on private property, but in a community that was like 95% African American. So we knew this was going to be a pretty crazy story. So we spent all day out there at the Klan rally. I interviewed Klansmen. I interviewed people from the Aryan Nation. I interviewed a bunch of people that were just out there. And the weird thing about that Klan rally was that it seemed just like a festival. There were bands playing. There were arts and crafts you could buy. There was food, all this kind of stuff. And at a certain point, we were like, well, we are going to just hang around, and they were going to burn a cross. And somebody got upset about some of the questions we were asking, because we were asking a lot of questions about how they raise their children. And so they kicked us out. It was private property. So we're on the outside and we're like, well, they're going to burn the cross. We have to get sound of that. You know, I mean, the story's not going to be complete without it. So we tried to sneak back in across the police perimeter. And we thought we were being incredibly stealth, but we were 21, so we weren't being incredibly stealth. And we're sneaking across a field, holding our gear, trying to have no one see us. And all of a sudden we hear them yell at us, and they told us to get to the ground, and the police dogs ran at us. Thankfully, they got the police dogs under control before they got to us. It was an incredibly stupid decision. And I would not recommend it for anybody, but I did it, and it wasn't the most wise thing I've ever done. But it was pretty extreme.
The things you do when we were 21, right?
Exactly, right?
Well, given all your success, all the stories you've been through, what advice would you give your younger self today, right in this very moment?
Oh, right in this very moment. Wow. Well, okay. I think the thing that I often tell people when I talk with them is you have to be incredibly comfortable outside your comfort zone. You are going to do things in this kind of career that you never imagined you'd have to do. You're going to have to talk your way past National Guards in order to get in to cover a tornado, for instance. You are going to be sitting next to President Carter the day after 9/11 and have to make conversation. There are lots of situations that you get in that you never thought you'd be in, but you are, and you have to embrace the idea that being uncomfortable is okay, because you learn, and you expand, and you get more confident, right? So I was a really shy, quiet person back in the day. Now I'm like, National Guard, okay, let's go, you know, so, yeah.
So a little birdie has told me that you are going to be on the panel for the Broadcast Educators Association coming up very soon. So please tell us about that and what you plan to speak on.
I am. I'm on 2 panels. The first panel that I'm on is a panel on podcasting, because I do a lot of podcasting. And I am giving a presentation on how to pitch your own podcast and make your own work if you want to be an entrepreneur, because that's what I do. I have a separate business in addition to teaching at Mercer, where I make podcasts. Amazing. So I'm speaking on that. And then my other panel is a panel on diversity, celebrating the 100th anniversary of radio broadcasting. And you might be like, okay, why? She's a white woman. Why is she on a panel about diversity? That's where a lot of my academic research is. And so for a big study that I did, I was really, really interested in whether or not people could recognize the race of a speaker, race or ethnicity, by voice alone, not seeing any other cues related to visuals or anything like that. And so I set up an experiment, and I had about 500 people that listened to African American, white, and Hispanic radio newscasters and tried to determine what race they were, how old they thought they were, what they thought their experience level was, and all this kind of stuff. So I'll be presenting the results of that research.
That sounds absolutely amazing. And you mentioned that you're working on some podcasts right now. What are you working on?
So I have been doing for the last probably year and a half podcasts on civil rights trails across the Southeast. So last year we launched the Alabama Civil Rights Trail podcast, which I did all the interviews for and wrote and sound designed and mixed, did all the production, basically all of it. It was pretty intense. And then the Mississippi Civil Rights Trail podcast just launched earlier this spring, but what I'm working on right now is the Tennessee Civil Rights Trail podcast. And so I'm in the thick of doing interviews with some really, really interesting people. Just in the last week, I've interviewed a guy named Al Bell, who was the head of Stax Records, which was the biggest African-American record label behind Motown.
Yes.
And he was based in Memphis during, at the time when Reverend King was assassinated. That's where Stax was based. So I've interviewed him, and then I interviewed another gentleman who was amazing. He has hosted a radio show in Memphis, Tennessee for 64 years.
Amazing.
He is 80 years old, and he started when he was 17. And so he saw all of that. And he was also a photographer for Ebony and Jet. And so he was taking photos of MLK when he was in Memphis. He also took photos of all kinds of events that happened during the civil rights movement. And so it's just so cool to hear their stories and get a chance to talk to them and help other people learn about that time.
I cannot wait to hear it. Well, y'all have heard it here first. I just spoke with Tanya Ott. We heard her amazing story. Make sure you listen out for her new podcast. It should be definitely coming soon.
Yep.
I know I'm excited to hear about it, so you should too. I'm Hunter Gauze, and we're signing off. Thanks.